Hi guys, this is a reading for the upcoming new moon in Sagittarius. And as always, this new moon is going to probably complement some of the themes we saw in the preceding full moon, which was in Gemini, especially since this one is in Sagittarius. So we have that same axis emphasized. And, I tend to think the full moon chart is sort of like the chart that exerts its effects most powerfully for a whole month. But perhaps the new moon chart as a complement to that can show us some more things as well, and maybe show us things on more an internal level, whereas the full moon maybe shows us things on a more external level. Not totally sure, but let's take a crack at it. So the first things to notice are just the big themes, right? We've got three planets in a fire sign, Sagittarius. We've got three planets in water signs split between Pisces and Scorpio. And then we've got one planet in Earth and no planets in air. So we have a lack of air, which means that there's a theme of lack of sociability, lack of objectivity, which is also naturally a new moon thing, a lack of objectivity or awareness, because there's nothing reflecting that light of the sun, which is, brings us into a more subjective kind of state. And we've got and yeah, without the air signs too, that's even a bigger theme. And we don't really have any oppositions either happening, at least no major ones. When we put in the trans-Saturnians here in a moment, we'll probably see some things. But yeah, there's not really any oppositions. Of the traditional planets, the whole thing is encased or enclosed by Mars and Venus, which is significant. They're kind of almost like little gatekeepers on the edges of the planetary kingdom within them. So so everything's contained within a trine when we just use the traditional bodies, which is significant and fascinating, because that also tends to point to a very insular kind of mentality, like again, like introversion, especially with the water signs emphasized and the air signs de-emphasized. So a lot of introversion, privacy, secrets, not necessarily wanting to go outside, not necessarily wanting to be social. These are some major themes for this full moon. And when you get fire and water together, they kind of cancel one another out, unfortunately. And so it's not uncommon for charts where there's a predominance of fire and water for there to be a lot of anger, especially, and frustration, especially if Mars is emphasized, because emotionality is extremely high. You have an increased level of sensitivity and an increased level of subjectivity and power with the fire signs. So this is kind of a broad time where people could be more sensitive and more likely to respond to it with rash decision making and even aggression, and and sort of it could just sort of stir things up. When you get water and fire together, you get steam, which actually, steam is very nice. It can be used for a lot of things, but it's sort of, it, you know as far as both the fire and water go, it makes things kind of impotent in a sense. So if you're looking at this and your own chart, and these things are coinciding with your own chart at this time in a major way, right? Then these are some themes that could be important in your life for the next couple weeks after this, because it takes about 2 weeks from new moon to full moon and back. So yeah, so just be aware of this this kind of like frustration that may occur, because there may be a sense of like wanting to rush things, wanting to do things quickly, wanting things to be your way, and being frustrated if they don't work out that way, and sort of taking it a little too personally, I think. The fact that we have a very de-emphasized Earth thing going on, and that Saturn is in the bounds of Jupiter and Capricorn. Jupiter is kind of a double-edged sword, that Saturn's in the bounds of Jupiter there, because that's not a very powerful Jupiterian bound for any other planet except Jupiter, because it's in the sign of Jupiter's fall. So it's kind of in general like a slightly tumultuous bound. So and Saturn is in the house of finances, right? And ruling that same house. It's also the house of family too. So it could be a period where people start to feel cut off from their families, or find that they really have to work hard for their money. They have to be more independent, more stoic about it. They have to get back to the necessities, and they'll have a little bit of luck because of that Saturn there, because of Jupiter's bounds, even though it's not the most fortunate Jupiter placement. But the cool thing is Jupiter is actually really, really strong where he is right now. He is combust, but just barely. That combustion is on its way out, and he's in his own bound and sign, so he's really strong. So there's a lot of like good fortune financially opening up in general for this new moon. It's going to encourage good things financially and so on. Obviously, for people who do talismanic work and astrological magic and stuff, this is a pretty excellent window that we have with Jupiter in his own bounds, which he's there until the 12th or 13th degree of the sign when he moves into Venus's bound. So Jupiter's quite strong there, which is nice. And I think even by 12th part, which we'll also get into, he's now in Aquarius, and he's even in his own bound again. So for those of you who utilize the 12th parts, this is, again, kind of a narrow window where Jupiter is going to be, again, pretty strong. Mars is separating from a square from Jupiter, but there's reception, so I don't think that square is going to be a huge problem. Mars is even in Jupiter's bound and sign. So we are seeing a lot of Jupiter bound stuff going on. We've got 3 planets in Jupiter bounds, and then 2 planets in Venus, 1 in Mars, and 1 in Saturn. We'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, I want to keep emphasizing this fact that Jupiter right now, he'll go out of this 12th part in about a degree. He's in this 12th part from 5 degrees to 7.5 degrees of Sagittarius. So while he's in this particular 12th part, he's really strong. And of course, the degree of the 12th parts will change more rapidly. So for this this new moon and right around it, he's also happens to be by 12th part in his own bound, again, making him like extremely powerful, in my opinion, at least for, certain matters, certain things. He doesn't have that same strength by 9th part, by Navamsha. He does fall into Taurus, which is not necessarily a great place for him to be. But right now I don't have the calculation software for Navamsha degrees. So he could actually be okay by Navamsha depending on what degree he falls. But we're not going to worry about the Navamshas too much right now. The Navamsha is not necessary to do powerful Jupiter things. It relates to some other stuff, but it would be pretty cool if he was powerful by all 3, Navamsha, sign position, and 12th part. But it's not necessary for good results. That's just sort of overkill. And I have a strong Virgo influence in my chart, so please forgive me. I get ahead of myself a bit. So all in all, that's a pretty damn good Jupiter, and it's a great window for doing Jupiter things. It's also good for travel, for religious studies, for meditation, again, for all things wealth and whatnot. It's even owning 2 fairly auspicious houses, right? The first is generally auspicious, and the 4th is somewhat auspicious as well. The 4th has to do with property and luxury and peace of mind and the private life. We do have Mars there, which again will kind of muck up things a bit for that theme. At least, forgetting about magic and talismans and stuff, but Mars there for the theme of life and whatnot, it can kind of create some turmoil and tumultuousness in your living situation, in your home life, and thus in your emotional life. But we'll talk about that some more in a moment. I want to kind of get back to Jupiter and Saturn. So I had said that, Saturn in the Jupiter bound is kind of a little problematic, because what that can also mean is becoming like falsely optimistic and becoming overburdened with financial stuff, that you start to it starts to ruin your faith and your optimism. So that can be something to keep in mind and look out for. This Saturn is also occidental, which is generally speaking fairly inauspicious for Saturn. It's not really great for him to be occidental. Um, it means that he's slower, more sluggish in what he brings, and that it's a more unconscious thing. So anytime we see a powerful Saturn, we want to think about not so much about like limitation and burdens, but we want to think about dealing with our primary and essential needs and getting back to our foundations, our skeletal structure, both psychologically and physically, right? So basically it's a question of, especially in the second house too, like what really are your needs and are you responsibly addressing them? And a lot of the times with Saturn, we tend to like get into a place where, okay, well, I just need the bare minimum. Well, okay, the bare minimum will bring you a bit of food and a bit of money and maybe some shelter, right? But depending on how you're thinking that bare minimum, you may have enough for your rent and to get some food, but then maybe you don't have enough for gas. Maybe you don't have enough to pay your phone bill. Maybe you don't have enough to take the time you really need to, to work on this Mars in the fourth house stuff, right? Conflicts in your home life and whatnot. So that's a really important thing to consider, is like what we think we need may be too much or too little, because you can also think you need too much of something as well. Like, oh, I really need the most high-end iPhone like right now. Well, unless you use your iPhone extensively for business and work and for filming things and taking photographs on a professional level or on a artistic, passionate level, right? You probably don't need that right away. But on the other end, you also don't think you also should think, oh, I don't need I don't need a phone at all or something, because that's the other extreme, right? In this day and age, most of us need some kind of a cell phone, or at least a house phone at the very least, right? So it's about really getting into what we need, not what we think we need or even think we don't need. So that's what that Saturn in the second is saying. And all in all, it's a pretty well placed Saturn. Let me look at the 12th part. Well, okay, I take that back. It's actually a pretty hairy Saturn. It goes into Aries by 12th part, and unfortunately, it doesn't go into a bound that's really going to help it. It just goes into Mercury's bound, so no big help there. So that Saturn is the type of thing where things may start out financially being, when this new moon influence is happening, things might seem financially secure, but there may be a lot of fear and doubt and frustration that ensues, and possibly like misery from extreme impatience. So the key with Saturn in Aries is to learn patience, basically. That's really all it's about. And to not curse the gods and to not curse your fate and things like that. Because again, that's impatience. That is a very martial thing. Mars wants to dominate everything and everyone, which of course can be very destructive at times. That's a very unhealthy Mars. And of course, Saturn in a Mars sign that's unhealthy for it. Well, actually, both of them are, but especially Aries, with no dignity or major compensation. That's difficult. That's a lack of patience. Let's see. Fortunately, maybe what's the 12th part degree of Saturn? Saturn's at 12 degrees Aries and Jupiter is at 6 degrees Sag natally. So the one good thing here is that Jupiter by 12th part sextiles that Saturn from Saturn's sign, but Jupiter trines that natal Jupiter. So sorry, regular position Jupiter trines that Saturn. So again, Jupiter with its like faith and abundance, with kind of following your gut and instinct because it's the first house, and getting your private life and your living affairs in order can really help that impatience, can help that Saturn. So that's one recourse we do have there. Let's see what else. What else is going on? Okay, so we also have K2, the south node, in the second house here, and K2 has a tendency to cause us to reject things in life. K2 can signify fears. It can signify kind of a longing or yearning for perfection or the beyond or some kind of enlightenment and so on. So basically, it's almost like when this Saturn stuff that I talked about may happen, then the default will be, because Ketu comes after Saturn, to just reject things, to just be like, fuck this financial stuffs, forget about this, like, family problems, I don't care, like I just don't even want to deal with it, and I'm going to go out and look for something better. Or it's like wishing that something will be like way, way better than it actually is, but not necessarily in a realistic way. And Venus is also, if we look at Venus's 2 degrees Scorpio, she just moved back in. And then the nodes are 28 Cancer. Well, that's actually a very close square. So Venus is still square the nodes during the time this full moon happens. So we have to keep that in mind too. Venus with the nodes, can mean like a very unrealistic expectation and obsession for luxuries, for the niceties of life, for emotional highs. And Venus is oriental, meaning she's rising before the sun will rise over the horizon. So Venus runs ahead of herself. That's our emotional life, really running ahead of itself. It's very progressive in terms of values and desires, but it's also a very impatient kind of Venus. And to boot, it's also in a Mars sign and bound. So extremely impatient kind of desire nature that could be influencing things in this chart, decreasing the stability that we may be able to procure for ourselves via, Saturn's position and Jupiter's position and whatnot. Saturn is also the third lord. And so the third lord in the second is going to bring, in general, possibly some challenges for siblings. It could also mean a miscommunication with siblings or neighbors or peer groups. And it can also bring a lot of personal efforts and even frustrations surrounding family and finances and whatnot. But the good thing is that Saturn rules both of these signs, so it's probably going to work itself out more functionally than dysfunctionally. It is, again, even though it signifies those things, it's also auspicious for procuring wealth because it is the second from the second. So that's, all in all, that's actually a positive influence. That's a constructive influence. So we have the potential to take what we have and look at it logically and rationally, which is a very Saturnic thing to do, and then multiply it, basically. So if it's good for investments, for stocks, for things like that, generally speaking. Although I would say I would be wary about investing money with people you don't know, or with anybody that just appears a little sketchy, because the moon is the 8th lord, and of course during new moon charts the moon is basically destroyed because it's combust. It's so completely combust. Some people might say, well, oh no, but it's Kazemi, so it's empowered. Generally speaking, though, the new moon is not very auspicious time to begin things. You have to wait till it gets a little, like at least 15, 16 degrees away from the sun to begin things, so that its light is showing. It's completely dark. And, I'm more interested in the astronomical facts of astrology than the theoretical ones. And the fact is, a new moon is the darkest period in the cycle of day and night. So just keep that in mind. It's an extremely subjective period where we have the potential for our emotions to be like renewed, which can also mean that we feel smothered or downtrodden or disconnected from our emotions. I don't think that's going to happen as much with this moon because we have the auspicious influence of powerful Jupiter in that sign, and we have a lot of watery planets. But it could mean for sure as well that we may feel things too much and have no control over them. If we look at the version of this chart with the trans-Saturnian planets, we have Neptune with Mars And Mars and Neptune are in a very close square to this new moon. And in fact, it is fortunately a separating square. These planets will separate from Mars, Neptune, but it's still there. A couple other things I want to point out. Let's look at the aspect table real quick here. We have some interesting things going on. We have Uranus contra parallel Venus. It's like an opposition aspect. We also have Pluto, Saturn, and the Sun all in parallel conjunction. So and they're very close as well. So that's very powerful. And we also have, I don't use these. I think that was the main thing. We also have something with Jupiter too. We have Jupiter. Where is that? We had something with Jupiter. Oh yes, we have Jupiter contra parallel the north node. So Jupiter node, basically, Jupiter node thing happening. And these are kind of like secret influences, so to speak. Going back to our regular chart, I wanted to look at the Antiscia as well. Antiscia is very important. So with the Antiscia, we have, okay, nothing big there with the moon, sun and moon just yet. We have Mercury. Mercury by Antiscia ends up being very close to the nodes, just a few degrees away. So that's interesting. Venus by Antiscia, nothing too major, except now she's square Mercury. So that's pretty strong. That's pretty powerful. Anticial thing going on. So there's basically a Venus-Mercury thing happening behind the scenes. Again, these are the more hidden influences. We have Mars at 16 Libra. That's not really super important, except, no, that's not really, yeah, I'm not going to make a big deal out of that. You can go crazy with this stuff. Jupiter at 23 Capricorn, again, not really a big deal. Saturn at 21 Sag, not a big deal. Okay, so, and the nodes, not really a big deal again. So what we're finding is we have these parallel, contra-parallel influences of Jupiter node, Venus, Uranus, and Sun, Saturn, Pluto. And we have a secret influence of Mercury and Venus, and arguably Mercury node as well, but that's a little wide. So we'll leave that alone probably for the video. But yeah, Venus, Mercury is significant because what that's going to do is bring them closer together in meaning in terms of their 12th house signification, right? They're both in the 12th house of secrets and of sort of hidden fears and phobias, but also, most importantly, surrender. So with Mercury in the 12th, just generally speaking, again, this is like kind of a thing warning us not to invest monies and invest emotionally too, even with new relationships that are a little sketchy, right? Don't invest money during this time per se. Work more with what you have, right? Second house. If you already have stocks and stuff, that's fine. I think you could probably capitalize on them, assuming the market's in a good state for those stocks you have. I don't know. I don't really follow the market, but I know just enough to get by. And, also in terms of the market, since I'm going there anyway, theoretically anything ruled by Jupiter in the market, any sort of companies that are very Jupiterian, theoretically may be good for stocks and stuff. I don't know. Jupiter is the exaltation lord of Cancer, so he can stand in for the moon as the lord of that and bring abundance and power from investments that we already have and whatnot, and in resources we have that is shared with others and whatnot. So that's cool. But yeah, Mercury deals with our ability to communicate, with lending, with anything that has to do with like mercantile kinds of activities. So that's why I'm saying, be wary about that stuff. And Mercury is stationing direct, so he's getting a little stronger. He's not retrograde. That's nice. He is going to get out of that 12th house soon. So it may be just more for the beginning of this period. And if he moves out within that 2-week period before the full moon, and conjoins Jupiter, which I actually don't know because I'm lazy and I don't feel like looking it up right now. But you can always look that up in an ephemeris if you know how to use one. Then actually when he does that, that'll be auspicious for all things monetary, I would say. Yeah, it'll be very auspicious for things monetary. It will be a little inauspicious, generally speaking, for having religious discussions and investigating religious doctrine, because it can be too much Jupiter, which means too much of, well, this is just what I believe kind of stuff happening, and circular logic justifying a bunch of bullshit. So that's kind of funny, but it could be a great time for people to study religious doctrines and stuff, and for scholars and scholarly activity. So that's kind of cool.